I still vividly remember the first day I stepped into Victor's house, a picture-perfect home nestled amidst the lush greenery by Lake Sammamish in Washington. The afternoon sunlight poured through the large glass windows, casting a gentle golden glow across the cozy living room, where every corner radiated warmth. Victor, with his warm smile and familiar deep voice, took my hand and led me inside. The house wasn't grand, but it was brimming with life, family photos adorning the walls, vibrant green plants tucked into corners, and a plaid-upholstered armchair sitting snugly next to a bookshelf. In the middle of the room, Caleb, Victor's 10-year-old son, was sitting on the rug, deeply engrossed in a Lego set. He wore a light blue t-shirt and striped shorts, his brown hair glowing under the afternoon sun like a little angel's halo. When Victor called his name, Caleb looked up, his round blue eyes filled with curiosity as they landed on me. I knelt down next to him, extended my hand, and said gently, "Hello, Caleb. I'm Maria. I hope we can be good friends." Caleb hesitated, his eyes betraying a mix of shyness and a flicker of eagerness. After a moment, he placed his small hand in mine. That touch, so warm and tender, is a memory I'll never forget. In the early days of living together, Caleb was quiet, often peeking from behind his bedroom door whenever Victor and I chatted. I understood, though. Losing his mother at just 9 years old, he needed time to adjust to my presence, a new stepmother. I began taking small steps to build a bond with Caleb. On afternoons after school, I invited him to join me in the kitchen to bake. At first, Caleb merely watched silently, but when he saw me clumsily spill flour all over the floor, he laughed. That laugh was the first I'd ever heard from him, a warm ray of sunlight breaking through and melting my heart. Before long, baking became our tradition. Caleb would end up covered in flour from head to toe, laughing uproariously when I struggled to knead the dough. He often added far too many chocolate chips to our cookies, but that's what made them uniquely ours. Victor would stand leaning against the doorframe, his smile beaming with pride as he watched the two of us laugh and play together. Life moved along peacefully. Victor loved me with the dedication of a man who had weathered life's storms. Every morning, he brewed coffee and made breakfast for the family. In the evenings, he played board games with Caleb while I curled up with a book in the familiar armchair. Once, Victor took us on a family outing. We paddled kayaks on Lake Sammamish, with Caleb sitting at the front, his face glowing with joy as he dipped his hands into the cool water. Victor sang a few cheerful songs, making both Caleb and me laugh. That night, we toasted marshmallows by the campfire, the warm glow illuminating Caleb's happy smile. During those early years, I truly believed I had found the perfect family. Caleb gradually opened his heart, calling me Mom for the first time on a sunny morning. My heart overflowed with joy. But happiness, like sunlight, doesn't last forever. Dark clouds began to gather without my noticing. It started with small signs, subtle changes in Victor's gaze, the unconscious sighs he let out while looking at his phone. But at that moment, I was so immersed in my happiness that I didn't realize the beautiful picture of our family was starting to show its first cracks. The happy years of our family began to fade on a cold winter day. That day, Victor received an unexpected call from an old business partner. I can still picture him standing frozen in the living room, holding his phone, his face darkened as if struck by lightning. "They've taken over the company," Victor muttered, his voice hoarse. Everything was sold off cheaply under their hands, and I didn't even see it coming. I didn't fully understand what had happened, but Victor's hollow gaze told me everything. He had lost everything he worked so hard to build, a company he had poured his heart and soul into. His rivals had not only taken over but had also destroyed him silently and ruthlessly. It wasn't just a financial loss, for Victor, it was a humiliation, a stab to his pride as a once confident and strong man. At first, Victor tried to stay strong. He spent hours at his computer, firing off emails and making countless calls, hoping to salvage something. But every door he knocked on slammed shut. Polite rejections like "we regret to inform you" or "sorry, we can't help" only deepened his despair. Then came the days he returned home, throwing his briefcase hard onto the table before collapsing onto the couch. "They're all hypocrites," he growled, his eyes burning with anger. "They used to beg me for help. And now? Just a failure, right?" I stood there, not knowing what to do but trying to maintain peace in the house. Victor was no longer the man I had fallen in love with. His rare smiles were replaced by frowns and cold stares. He turned to alcohol for solace. At first, it was just a small bottle after dinner, but soon, relentless drunkenness became a habit. His patience with me and Caleb disappeared. The initial outbursts were just harsh words, but things escalated over time. One night, when Caleb accidentally spilled a glass of water on the table, Victor lost control. "Useless kid," he shouted, his face flushed with alcohol. "All you do is ruin everything." Caleb trembled as he bent down to pick up the broken pieces. I rushed in front of him, my voice trembling as I pleaded, "Victor, calm down. It was just an accident." But his bloodshot, furious eyes were no longer those of the man I once knew. At 15, Caleb was no longer the innocent boy he used to be. The cracks in our family etched themselves deep into his soul, like scratches on wood left unpolished for years. He never said it, but I knew he felt everything, the instability, the violence, and the pain Victor brought into our home. Some nights, when Victor's shouts echoed through the house, I would see Caleb standing at the top of the stairs. His silhouette cast in the dim hallway light, his eyes filled with anger and helplessness as he looked down at me hastily cleaning up the mess Victor had made. He never said a word, just gripped the railing tightly, his lips pressed together so hard they turned white. "I'm fine, Caleb," I always tried to reassure him, my voice trembling but firm. But he would only nod, his eyes lingering on the bruises on my arms that I tried to hide under long sleeves. Caleb began to change, little by little, in ways only a mother could notice. Once a cheerful boy who laughed at my stories during dinner, he now ate in silence, occasionally glancing at Victor as if trying to predict when the next outburst would come. He spoke less and started locking himself in his room. The once vibrant space filled with Lego models and books he loved now felt cold and gloomy. I tried to bring some light back into his life, buying new books, new puzzle sets, but they were all pushed aside. Sometimes, I heard loud noises from his room, furniture being slammed against the walls, chairs toppling over. One evening, I knocked gently on his door. "Caleb, are you okay?" "Don't worry, Mom," he replied, his voice hoarse from behind the door. But when I turned the doorknob, it was locked tight. I knew Caleb was dealing with far more than he let on. 15 is not just an age of growth, it's a time when emotional wounds can leave deep scars. He was torn between respecting his biological father and hating the man Victor became in his anger. One night, when Victor came home drunk and knocked over a chair in the living room, Caleb rushed downstairs, his eyes red with tears. "Stop it, Dad," he yelled, his voice breaking with fury. Victor spun around, his face contorted with rage. "What did you say to me?" He staggered toward Caleb, raising his hand. I stepped between them, shouting, "Victor, stop. What are you doing?" Victor froze for a moment, glaring at me, before sneering and stumbling into the bedroom, leaving Caleb and me in the middle of a room reeking of alcohol. I turned to Caleb. He didn't cry, but his eyes, deep and filled with anguish, broke my heart. I pulled him into a hug, running my fingers through his hair like I did when he was a child. "I'm sorry, Caleb. I'm so sorry you had to see this," I whispered. "I'm fine," he murmured, but his voice cracked. "I just don't understand why you put up with it." I knew I couldn't let Caleb get caught in the spiral of violence and despair. I tried to shield him from the worst of it. I told him to go to his room whenever Victor started drinking heavily. I did everything I could to keep him away from the arguments. One day, Caleb walked into the kitchen and saw me applying cream to a bruise on my arm. He stood silently for a moment before stepping forward and gently placing his hand over mine. "You don't have to do this, Mom," he said, his voice steady and far more mature than his years. "You're the only reason I do," I replied, forcing a smile. But I knew he didn't believe me. And maybe, I didn't believe myself either. I tried my best to protect Caleb from further harm. But the cracks in his spirit grew wider and deeper. He began withdrawing from friends, and I could see him losing the innocence he deserved to hold on to. Watching Caleb every day felt like watching a beautiful flower wither away, and the worst part was, I didn't know how to stop it. Victor had completely lost himself, and I could no longer recognize the man who once looked at me with such love. These days, he was like an unrelenting storm, destroying everything in his path. Every time Victor came home reeking of alcohol, fear enveloped the house like a shadow. Caleb and I would fall silent, doing everything we could not to provoke him. Victor's outbursts had escalated far beyond shouting. His anger turned violent, cruel. He didn't hesitate to smash furniture or throw whatever was within reach to the floor. Whenever I tried to intervene, Victor would shove me aside and yell with ferocious eyes. "Shut up! Who do you think you are to lecture me?" Caleb, now 17, could no longer sit idly by while I was hurt. One night, after Victor overturned the dining table in frustration over a soup I had cooked, Caleb stormed out of his room and grabbed Victor's arm. "That's enough. Stop it, Dad." Victor turned to him, his bloodshot eyes glaring like those of a predator facing a challenger. "You dare defy me, you little punk?" Before Caleb could respond, Victor shoved him hard against the edge of the table. The dull thud of impact echoed through the room as Caleb collapsed to the ground, clutching his back in pain. I rushed between them, shouting, "Victor! Stop it! What are you doing to your own son?" Victor stood there, breathing heavily, his gaze vacant and detached. He muttered something unintelligible before stumbling upstairs, leaving Caleb and me amid the wreckage. Caleb didn't cry, but his deep, cold eyes made it feel as if a part of his soul had been lost. I pulled him into an embrace, but he pushed me away, his voice icy. "Don't worry about me, Mom. You should worry about yourself." Those words pierced my heart like a dagger. I knew he wasn't angry with me, but his wounds had gone beyond what words could heal. Caleb began to change rapidly. He became quieter, rarely smiled, and his gaze was filled with resentment. Some nights, I heard him throwing things in his room or letting out heavy sighs from behind his half-closed door. I tried to talk to him, but Caleb always turned me away, sometimes with a shake of his head, other times with curt replies. "I'm fine. Don't worry about me." But I knew he wasn't fine. He was merely trying to hide the cracks in his spirit, much like I had tried to hide mine. I couldn't let Caleb continue to suffer. From that day on, I resolved to protect him at all costs. Whenever Victor came home drunk, I absorbed the brunt of his anger, shielding Caleb from further harm. One night, Victor stormed into the living room and saw Caleb reading a book. He snatched it from Caleb's hands and hurled it to the floor. "Useless brat. All you do is hide in your room. Can't you do anything right?" I stepped between them, my voice calm but firm. "Victor, leave him alone. If you have a problem, take it out on me." Victor let out a derisive laugh, his eyes wild and unhinged. "You always take his side. It's pathetic." One evening, Victor came home later than usual. When I opened the door, he lunged at me, gripping my arm, his voice slurred. "Do you know what I've had to endure? This is all your fault." I tried to pull away, but his grip was too strong. Caleb came rushing down the stairs, grabbing Victor's arm and shouting, "Let go of her." Victor turned, shoving Caleb to the floor. Caleb tried to get up, his eyes blazing with fury, but before he could do anything, I pulled him back, holding him tightly as though trying to shield both of us from the monster Victor had become. In that moment, I realized I couldn't go on like this. Caleb was no longer a child, and he deserved a better life than the hell Victor had created. I vowed that no matter the cost, I would not let Caleb be consumed by violence and darkness. Our lives had become a string of bleak days, with Victor at the center of every storm. But my love for Caleb remained the only light keeping me going. I didn't know how much longer I could endure, but I knew that as long as Caleb needed me, I wouldn't give up. The darkness in our home was no longer just the absence of light, it was a heavy, suffocating veil that filled every corner, crushing every breath. Victor continued to come home drunk, and I couldn't recall the last time he spoke a kind word to me. Yet, no matter how thick the night became, there was always a sliver of light, a small but unwavering beacon that kept me from falling into the abyss. Caleb was that light. Every time Victor unleashed his fury, Caleb was there, helping me clean up the wreckage he left behind. Silently, he picked up shards of broken porcelain and neatly placed them on the kitchen counter, his eyes sad but free of complaint. Once, when I accidentally cut my hand while picking up a piece of glass, Caleb held my hand, pressing it against his palm as if trying to transfer some of the warmth he himself so desperately needed. "Let me do it, Mom," he whispered, his voice trembling. I didn't resist, I only looked at Caleb through tear-filled eyes. In that moment, he was no longer a teenager needing protection. Caleb had grown, becoming a companion in the endless storm we faced together. Some nights, after Victor had passed out, Caleb and I would sit together in the living room, the soft glow of the table lamp pushing back the gloom. He held a book, pretending to read, but his eyes were on me. "Are you okay, Mom?" Caleb asked, his voice warm and steady. I forced a smile, though it was strained. "I'm fine, don't worry about me." But I knew Caleb didn't believe me. His eyes were filled with concern, though he said nothing more. Instead, he pulled a blanket over my legs and returned to his silence. That quiet wasn't oppressive, it was a refuge, a moment where we could both forget the harsh reality, however briefly. I didn't know when the feeling began. Perhaps it was when Caleb gently held my hand, his fingers tender yet firm, as if shielding me from the pain life had inflicted. Or maybe it was when I applied ointment to a bruise on his shoulder, watching him bite his lip to hold back tears. "Does it hurt?" I asked, my voice choking. Caleb shook his head, but his eyes told a different story. He looked at me for a long time, his gaze heavy with unspoken emotions, pain, conflict, and something deeper, more complex. The first time Caleb held my hand tightly, we both froze. It wasn't just the grip of a son seeking comfort from his stepmother, it was a silent promise that he would always be there, no matter what. Sometimes I wondered if I had crossed a line. Was my love for Caleb truly just the affection of a stepmother? Or was there something more, something that defied the boundaries society imposed? Each time the thought crossed my mind, guilt followed close behind. Yet, I couldn't stop myself from replaying the moments we shared. Caleb was the only light in my dark world. I didn't know if it was right or wrong, but I knew one thing for certain, I couldn't lose him. One night, when Victor was away, Caleb sat beside me, his eyes fixed on the flames dancing in the fireplace. "Mom," he said, his voice hoarse, "I promise to protect you, no matter what." I turned to him, tears streaming down my face. "You don't have to do that. I'm the adult, I'm supposed to protect you." Caleb shook his head, his eyes filled with determination. "You've protected me for long enough. Now it's my turn." I said nothing more, only pulled him into a hug. In that moment, I realized that even in the depths of hell, the small light of love and empathy could guide us through. The house, though shrouded in darkness, still held glimmers of light. And I believed that as long as we clung to those glimmers, we wouldn't fall. Victor returned home earlier than usual that evening. The door slammed open with a force that startled me. Caleb and I were sitting on the floor, repairing a broken chair from the night before. The porch light cast Victor's shadow across the room, a looming nightmare made real. He stood there, his eyes bloodshot, his breath reeking of alcohol. Without a word, he stared at me, then at Caleb, suspicion and hatred burning in his gaze. "I told you to stay away from her," Victor hissed, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. "Who do you think you are, huh? You useless brat." "That's enough, Victor," I shouted, struggling to keep my voice steady. I stood up, placing myself between him and Caleb. You don't get to talk to him like that. Victor stepped closer, his eyes wild. You're defending him? Who do you think he is to deserve that? A freeloader living off me? Caleb stood up, his gaze unwavering. Don't talk to her like that, he said, his voice firm. Victor laughed bitterly, a sound dripping with mockery and rage. Her? She's not your mother. And you have no right to interfere in my business. Caleb didn't back down. You're not the kind of father I want to respect. The words were like gasoline on a fire. Victor lunged at Caleb, throwing a punch that landed squarely on his face. Caleb stumbled but didn't fall. He stood up immediately, his eyes blazing with fury and resolve. I screamed, rushing to step between them, but Victor shoved me aside. Caleb and Victor grappled, and the room became a battlefield. The sounds of blows landing, furniture breaking, and ragged breaths filled the air. Stop it! Both of you, stop! I shouted, but neither of them listened. Victor used his strength to pin Caleb to the ground. You dare defy me? He roared, his hands tightening around Caleb's throat. The sight was a knife to my heart. I threw myself at Victor, pulling at him with all my might. Stop it, Victor! You'll kill him. Victor turned, shoving me aside like I was nothing. I hit the floor hard, my head striking the corner of the table. The world blurred, but I heard Caleb's desperate scream. Don't you dare touch her! Caleb surged up, shoving Victor away. He stood protectively in front of me, his arms outstretched like a shield. You won't hurt her anymore, Caleb said, his voice trembling but resolute. Victor picked up a broken bottle nearby, wielding it like a weapon. You think you can stand up to me? He snarled, charging at Caleb. Time seemed to freeze. Caleb raised his arm to block the attack, the shards slicing into his skin. Blood dripped onto the floor. Caleb! I screamed, tears pouring down my face. Victor stepped back, perhaps shocked by the sight of blood. Caleb, though injured, stood tall, his eyes steady. This is the last time you hurt my mom, he said, his voice low but unyielding. I rushed to Caleb, wrapping my arms around him, feeling the weight of his pain. Are you okay? I asked, my voice breaking. I'm fine, Caleb replied, though I knew he wasn't. Victor stood frozen, his hands trembling. This is all your fault, he shouted, pointing at me. You ruined everything. I met his gaze, no longer afraid. No, Victor. You destroyed this family. Victor fell silent, stepping back as if realizing he had lost everything. He was no longer a threat, no longer a tyrant, just a broken man surrounded by the ruins of what he had built. I led Caleb to his room, cleaning and dressing his wounds. I'm so sorry, I whispered, tears streaming down my face. It's not your fault, Caleb said softly, his voice filled with reassurance. I won't let him hurt you anymore. In that moment, I understood that Caleb was more than just a light in my life. He was my anchor, the reason I had endured. And now, we had faced hell together. Though the path ahead was uncertain and fraught with challenges, I knew I was no longer alone. The police arrived the next morning, alerted by neighbors who had heard the shouting. Victor was taken away, his face hardened, his eyes void of life like a deep, empty abyss. I stood there, holding Caleb in my arms, as the police car doors slammed shut. That day, our home fell eerily silent, not the kind of peace I had dreamed of, but the silence of loss. I decided to leave the house. Not because I wanted to erase the memories, but because I knew I couldn't live in a place so steeped in darkness and pain. With what little money I had left, I took Caleb to a small mountain town in Colorado. We rented a modest house on a hillside. It wasn't big or luxurious, but it was enough for the two of us to start over. Caleb, though still quiet and withdrawn, seemed to find some peace in the crisp mountain air and winding trails of the small town. As for me, I began working at a local coffee shop to support us. But no matter where we went, the shadows of the past clung to us like a relentless specter. I watched Caleb grow stronger each day, yet I also noticed the subtle cracks in his spirit, wounds that I couldn't heal. He began to draw. His drawings were vibrant yet somber. Some depicted our old house, while others featured blurred, indistinct faces. One day, as I looked at a new piece he had made, I realized it was of me, my eyes reflecting all the conflicts I never voiced. "I'm sorry for everything you've had to endure, Mom," Caleb said one afternoon as we sat on a bench overlooking the valley. I shook my head, forcing a smile. "No, Caleb. You're not the reason. You're the only light in my life." I write these words now, sitting in our small room as the sunset streams through the window. There are nights when I wonder whether I did the right thing or the wrong thing. Was I right to protect Caleb, to love him with all my heart, even beyond the bounds of conventional morality? Or was I wrong for letting that love surpass what the world deems acceptable? I fought to shield him, but what was the cost? Sometimes, I wish someone could tell me what to do, what to think. But then I realize no one can answer those questions for me. Everyone has their own way of defining right and wrong. And in my heart, all I know is that my love for Caleb is genuine, without any intention of harming anyone. Caleb came to me, his eyes filled with determination. "We'll be okay, won't we, Mom?" I nodded, unsure but hopeful. "Yes, we'll be okay. We've been through hell, Caleb. As long as we're together, I believe things will get better." My story isn't one of perfect happiness or moral lessons. It's the story of a woman, a boy, and a love that grew out of darkness. It may be right, it may be wrong, but it's real. And I hope that, regardless of what you think of me, this story makes you wonder, in the deepest darkness, what light would you choose to guide you? Did I make the right choice? Or the wrong one? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want to hear more stories about complex relationships and life's toughest decisions, don't forget to like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and most importantly, subscribe to my channel so you don't miss the next one.